I am using the Afrobarometer dataset with original sample size of n equals 1,197 people. For my country, I decided to pick Ghana, which is a very poor country and where people rely on basic necessities like food in everyday life, and which they go without often. I wanted to see what demographic factors contribute to lower living conditions in Ghana. I therefore decided to pick my dependent variable as living conditions, which, as I previously mentioned, in Ghana are highly related to does a person have food or basic necessities. As my independent variables, I decided to choose gender, also occupation, which I recoded based on the job level and value of production and output, and safety and security from crime. For my first hypothesis, I think that males are likely to have a lower perception and a poorer perception for their living conditions. This is because men have to work mainly to maintain their families in less developed countries, and a lot of the work is very hard and labor intensive in Ghana because it is a less developed country. And it's very hard for people to provide for their families, especially males, and they have to, in some cases, provide even more for their families than for themselves because of scarcity of food. In many countries, it can be observed that there is lower life expectancy for males. My second hypothesis is that lower occupation, for example, in primary production, will lead to lower living conditions because there is harder work involved, there are less rights, and there are lower wages. Thirdly, crime and violence, if it's worse, I think this will lead to worse living conditions because people are likely to live in poorer neighborhoods. Examining the results for my correlation analysis, I can see that there is a negative correlation coefficient for my gender variable, independent variable, which suggests that as you move from male to female, because they're coded male 1 and female 2, they're actually lower living conditions, which is not what I expected in my hypothesis. Also, r squared is 0.003, which suggests that gender is not at all explanatory of variance in living conditions. A possible reason for this might be that females, although they may not work as much as often or as much as males, have a situation where they're also stressed out. They work in the family, taking care of children. Some women may have to get ahead with their families, for example, single parents, and others who give birth. There are likely poor conditions for this in Ghana, with poor healthcare. My second hypothesis with occupation is proved to be correct, in that people of lower occupations, for example, those producing primary goods or primary production, have a lower perception of their living conditions. But this is weak. 0.13 is relatively insignificant and unexplanatory because it's less than 0.015. Similarly, safety is also proved correct for my hypothesis. However, the positive correlation coefficient is also very small and quite insignificant and unexplanatory. For both of these, my second and third hypothesis, r squared is about 2%, which means that for these independent variables, they're to some extent, but very small, explanatory of variance in living conditions. Under multiple regression analysis, it can be seen that r squared is 1.75, which suggests that it's very insignificant and negligible, and that the independent variables are not very explanatory of the dependent variable and its variation. The first b value for males is negative, which suggests that males view their living conditions as 13% better than females. As for those of a lower occupation, they view their living conditions as 1/25 worse, which is very small, in comparison with those of higher occupations. And similarly, those who think crime and violence and safety is very poor only view their living conditions as 1/20th worse than those that don't. Now I'm going to look at multiple regression with a dummy variable. I decided to look at race, which was quite interesting. Black Africans from our frequency distribution represent 70%, whites 20%, and Asians 5%. And the rest are either mixed race or Arabs. As an extra hypothesis, I would think that Black Africans who are locals, given the period of colonization where European whites and Asian tradespeople set up, were not given as many rights and opportunities, and so they would view their living conditions as worse, relatively. When looking at the results from this multiple regression with the addition of a dummy variable, it can be seen that the explained variance by r squared is 3.3%, which is actually 1.55 percentage points higher than in the other multiple regression without dummy variable. But it is still insignificant and negligible, as the independent variables do not explain much variation in a dependent variable for present living standards. When looking at the new b values for occupation, safety, and gender, my former independent variables, and current also, it shows that lower occupation will produce an increase of 0.19 or 19% in living standards, higher than before. Males similarly perceive their living standards as 13% like before. That is better than females. And 1 unit change in opinion from safety and crime and violence will lead to a 13% increase in living standards. That is 1 unit increase, of course. When looking at the race dummy variable, it can be seen that Arabs and South Asians have perceptions of their living standards that are 1.4 and 0.8 categories lower than blacks, respectively. Sorry, my apologies, it is the other way around. With Arabs 1.4 and South Asians 0.8 categories lower than blacks. The Asians is surprising to me, and a likely explanation for this is that these are actually only South Asians from like India and Pakistan, and they were not as involved in trade, and therefore were not necessarily more affluent during the colonial period than native black Africans, and so they have no advantage necessarily. Whites are, however, higher than native black Africans, whereas white perceptions are minimally better, about 1/10. In conclusion, we are looking at a situation where females and or people of lower level of occupation, of value or production output, and or poor safety, and or South Asian in this case, have poorer perceptions of their living conditions. This will likely help inform the government on how to improve living conditions in terms of which kind of people to assist.